If you've heard it before, where do you think you've heard it before? No ideas? Okay. What era of our country is it from? Yeah, this is absolutely a Vietnam War song. This is about basically how war is gone into for reasons that don't mean anything, and it's gone out when we come out from it. It didn't end up meaning anything, and that's definitely a feeling of the Vietnam era. But we're going to ask ourselves the question: was war good for anything for Italy and Serbia either? Did either of them go into the war feeling like that, and did either of them come out of the war feeling like that? So we're going to explore that idea as we go through this presentation. So, oh, here's a clicker. Maybe. There we go. All right, so I have kind of a long intro, and I will read it through, and we'll get to the thesis towards the end. So this song, which is this version that I played for you, is by Edwin Starr, but it's immortalized in the public sentiment felt towards the Vietnam War by the late 1960s. For all of the world's technical advances, mankind still engaged in what many saw as senseless warfare, aimed at solving unimportant political agendas. In the late 19th century, the feeling about war was the polar opposite. In a time when war brought riches, land, and power, the act of war was often glorified and intentionally sought. Otto von Bismarck had used war between 1864 and 1871 to manipulate and control European politics, ending the Metternich system set by the Congress of Vienna in 1815. Bismarck's wars culminated in the unification of Germany. War had also been justified by Great Britain and Austria-Hungary, bringing both wealth and resources through colonies and dukedoms. Countries sought war for glory and honor as a reaffirmation of its strength and greatness. In the case of Russia, the loss in the Crimean War in 1854 brought Mother Russia shock and shame. Further proof of its weakness was found again in the loss of the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Glory and affirmation of her greatness eluded Russia because it had lost wars, not because it had entered them. In anticipation of all that could be gained in war, countries militarized to ensure their success. Italy and Serbia were not immune to the forces at work in Europe by the late 19th century. The view that war was a positive tool to empower a country became a catalytic fuel poured onto the fire of nationalism that burned in Serbia. This powder keg was created with the Austrian-Hungarian annexation of Bosnia. Serbian nationalism grew radical and militant. So here's a thesis statement. I have one for each country. The assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand by the Black Hand in 1914 made it impossible for Serbia to use diplomatic means during the war, making its entry inevitable after June 1914. Engaged in a battle for life and death and homeland, Serbia expected nothing less than a total war if it hoped to achieve its goal of independence. By the end of the war, Serbia's government in exile was planning the formation of a new Slavic state. And then for Italy, a new country bent on catching up with the European powers by acquiring land, bought into the belief that war was a successful way to achieve power and glory. With land as the bait, the Allies convinced Italy to join their side in 1915. Although Italy experienced much hardship during the war, its unevenly industrialized economy and poorly trained and supplied army did little to advance the Allied fronts. Having delayed its entry for a year, Italy was fully aware that World War I was a total war for all involved, and willingly accepted the price of a total war conflict anyway. Okay, so thesis over. I'm going to show you a quick timeline. I'm going to refer to the dates throughout the presentation, but the red is basically things that are applying to Italy primarily, and the blue are applying to Serbia primarily. So for Serbia, we're looking at more of its freedom from the Ottoman Empire, its involvement in the Balkan Wars, what's happening during the war in terms of its fight against Austria-Hungary and later German forces helping Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria, ultimately losing and then finding its way back eventually as the Central Powers start to lose. Then they can regain Serbian territory right at the end of the war until eventually they form a new country. And then with Italy, we have it involved in the Triple Alliance, but deciding not to back the rest of the Triple Alliance in the war because it was Austria-Hungary that made the first move. They were not attacked, so then Serbia or Italy did not feel like they had to, and they didn't really want to. But then with the promise of gaining land, the Allies were saying you can have this land in the secret Treaty of London in 1915. Then they were able to decide to join, or at least the government decided to join, and then they go through a series of losses, eventually successes, and the end of the war for them. So for Serbia, what is the spark? What started the Balkan War? That's the first question we're looking at for Serbia. And on your sheet, 2 of the questions are for Serbia and 2 of them are for Italy. So the European powers are swarming around the Balkans that are still considered dangerous. This is a explanation of what it would have been like to be in the Balkans in the years prior to World War I. The Balkans are pictured as a snake. Snakes are not super friendly animals sometimes, especially when they're pictured coiled and ready to strike. So the Balkans are something that, although all of these countries, Russia, Austria, Germany, they're swarming around seeing what kind of a peace they can get out of the Balkans, what kind of influence they can have. Ultimately, the Balkans are not an easy target. There's a lot of powder keg there as well. This is a map of Serbia. So Serbia is a relatively new country in the early 20th century, and it is a Slavic state. It's formed out of the Ottoman Empire, or previously controlled by the Ottoman Empire. It gets its freedom, but there are a lot of places around it that don't have their freedom from European or Ottoman Empire control. So one example is this area up here, which is going to be Bosnia-Herzegovina. And Sarajevo, which is where the assassination of the Archduke will happen, is in that area that is in the place of Bosnia. But Bosnia doesn't have autonomy at the moment, so that's something that's going to lead to nationalism from Serbia bleeding over into Sarajevo. Here we have Montenegro, another one of these former Ottoman Empire states, Albania, Greece, and Bulgaria and Romania up there. On a wider scale, Serbia is here. We have the Austria-Hungarian Empire. Bosnia, again, and Herzegovina are right here. Albania, Montenegro, Bulgaria, Greece. So those are the major players for Serbia. Sarajevo was basically considered the capital of the Balkans. It was an incredibly important city to the Slavic people. It was a cultural center and heart, and so it being controlled by Austria-Hungary after 1908 when it was annexed is not a positive thing if you are someone who believes in Slavic independence, especially Southern Slavic independence like the Serbs did. The Serbs wanted to be the leaders of that movement, and they believed themselves capable of that because they had the strongest military and army after the Balkan Wars, which we'll get into in a minute. So the Serbs see the freedom first of Bosnia and Herzegovina, then later maybe the incorporation with Serbia into a bigger state. They see that as central to their nationalistic growth. In May of 1911, the Black Hand will form. The Black Hand is one of many different nationalist organizations that form in Serbia, but the Black Hand is the one that is responsible for the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand, so we'll bring that up now. The secret society, nationalist Serbians, but oftentimes they're operating inside Bosnia because that is where the oppression is happening, or at least in their mind, that is where Austria-Hungary is controlling an area that doesn't want to be controlled. And so that the nationalistic forces operate a lot of the time in Bosnia. So they're organizing and training inside Serbia, but operating inside Bosnia. Austria-Hungary, we can see here, divided up into lots of different areas. Bosnia is this area, Sarajevo, we see it's right next to where Serbia is over here. There are other areas, if they're in color, then there are other areas that are contain nationalities that are not Austrian, not German, and then Hungary is controlled primarily by the Magyar group. So in 1912 we have the Balkan Wars, and this is a precursor to World War I in the Balkans themselves because for Serbia and for the rest of the Balkan states, this is where they're trying to exert their independence against the Ottoman Empire. So Ottoman Empire has a lot of control, but it's been on the decline for a long time. So as these nationalist areas, these nationalist groups decide that they would like to have more independence, they have a better chance now than they ever would have before when the Ottoman Empire was strong. So here, Montenegro, Bulgaria, Greece, and Serbia, who are all free states, are forming themselves against the Ottoman Empire in order to exert their independence. They are successful in their war against the Ottoman Empire. They trigger the Ottoman Empire's collapse by being successful in this war. It will collapse ultimately at the end of World War I, but all of that is precursored by what happens in the Balkan Wars and by the fact that they were able to defeat the Ottoman Empire. But it doesn't last long, this alliance between the League, because the next year Bulgaria will decide to attack the forces of Serbia. And this second war pits Bulgaria against the rest. Serbia wins, which means that they are now the strongest of these independent states in the Balkans. So Serbia has a major role to play by being the leader of the Slavic states. They also are dependent upon the northern Slavic state, which is Russia, to give them support and hopefully promise to back them in the future if something else happens. If they are attacked, say by Austria-Hungary, or if something else happens that they are wanting to connect with Russia. And Russia also has that same interest. For a long time, Russia has been interested in the Balkans, trying to exert force, trying to expand its control through the Black Sea. They have wanted to have their navy be able to expand from the Black Sea for a long time. They've always been prevented. But ultimately, Russia would like to be able to connect up with the southern Slavic states so that there would be a movement of pan-Slavism with Russia as a leader. So they believe in nationalist and Slavic aims versus Austrian dominance, and this is encouraged by Russia because of their ethnic connections. Then we get to the triggering point of World War I, which is the assassination of Archduke and Archduchess Sophia. Unfortunately, this actually happens on their wedding anniversary. They are in Sarajevo exploring or staging parades and things through Sarajevo, which was the newest acquisition of Austria-Hungary. It was the newest place that they had control over. He is the heir to the throne. He is the nephew of Emperor Francis. And when they arrive, there's an initial assassination attempt that does not work. They go back and they go to visit the hospital where people who got hurt in the first attack were, and they just so happen to drive by another one of the assassins who thought they had failed, but he's buying a sandwich from a sandwich shop, walks out, sees the carriage go by, and shoots both of them, and both of them are killed. So that assassin is Gavrilo Princip, which is listed on your sheet. So once this happens, this is going to trigger the July crisis, where we have, over the course of the month of July, multiple countries becoming more belligerent, becoming more militaristic, starting to get their forces being ready to mobilize, and ultimately deciding whether or not they're going to attack. Because of the alliance system that is a precursor to all of the, which is a precursor to all of the war, Austria-Hungary is going to make a decision that is going to impact Serbia. Serbia is not going to have a lot of choice once the alliance system kicks in. If Austria-Hungary decides to attack, Serbia is not going to be able to repel that attack on its own. So once that decision is made, it's made for Serbia with or without its consent. So as the alliances kick in, the timeline here, July 23rd, Austria is going to give Serbia a list of demands. There's 10 demands, and they have 48 hours with which to comply. That's a very short time frame, and it's not what we would necessarily consider fair, especially because Serbia is not necessarily responsible for what happened. Austria and Germany will both blame Serbia. They blame Serbia as the instigator of the assassination, or at least as the country that harbored the assassins by allowing the Black Hand to develop and not nipping it in its bud. But there's only evidence that a small element of the lower levels of government even knew that there was anything being planned. The higher levels of government had no idea what was going on. But there is evidence that an army officer who was operating on the Serbian border did have awareness. Whether or not he helped plan it, that's kind of a historical question. But regardless of how much involvement the Serbian government had, Serbia is blamed by Austria-Hungary and by Germany. Austria is also looking for a reason to invade. Prior to even sending the demands on July 7th, they had instructed their ambassador to Serbia to break off diplomatic relations regardless of what the Serbian response was. So they're planning an invasion regardless of what the outcome Serbia was going to have to their demands. Serbia is hoping that Russia will back them. There's not a formal agreement in place, but they believe that Russia will come to their aid because that is the understanding they have had for a long time. Russia will end up backing them, but only after the next events happen. So Serbia agrees to all of Austria-Hungary's demands except for 2 of them. And the 2 they will not agree to are 2 that they believe will break their sovereignty. So a lot of Austria's demands had to do with, you know, you have to back down. You have to put clamps on these people and limit what all these members of these associations can do. You have anyone who is in your education departments or in your distracting snow. Is that what's happening over here? Oh, lovely. Why wasn't it last night? But basically, the other demands were things that, although they were heavily limiting to Serbia by saying, hey, if you've got professors who are saying anything anti-Austria, you need to kick them out. If you've got army officers who are saying anything anti-Austria, you have to kick them out. Those are bad enough, but the ones that they would not agree to involved Austria-Hungary being able to have leaders come in and direct the search for what happened. Basically being able to take over parts of their government and be able to decide the punishments and stuff like that inside of Serbia. Serbia believed that would violate their sovereignty, so they don't agree to those 2. The evidence shows that Austria was going to attack regardless of what their response was, but they couldn't agree to those 2, so that's enough of a pretense to attack. So Austria will declare war on July 28th of 1914. That is when the first declaration of war occurs in World War I. As the alliances kick in, Russia decides to mobilize to protect Serbia. Mobilization is not a declaration of war, but it is an opportunity to say, we need to get our troops ready for what is probably going to happen. Mobilizing means you are moving troops around, probably moving them to the borders. You are activating things like conscriptions and getting your whole systems of supply in place. So that happens, and they are hoping that Austria will back down. Austria will not. Austria will actually declare war on Russia. Germany is going to back Austria. They have sworn to back Austria. They had already promised them a blank check if Austria decided to invade or attack Serbia. So on August 1st, Germany will declare war on Russia because they had wanted Russia to back down, and that didn't happen. So this is all happening in very quick succession. And while this is happening, Austria is already bombing the capital of Serbia, which is Belgrade. So that had happened the night of their declaration of war. Germany will draw in France and Great Britain. August 1st, France will begin to mobilize. August 2nd, Germany will basically send an ultimatum to Belgium, who is in their way if they want to attack France. At least if they want to attack France, not through dense forests or through the mountains. They have to go through Belgium. So they want to allow their armies to pass through on the way to France or else. And since Belgium is not in a position to do anything about this, they call out to Great Britain for help. And that will bring in Great Britain. So August 3rd, Germany will go to France, and they invade Belgium. Britain sends Germany an ultimatum saying, please don't do that, and withdraw. Great Britain knows that Germany's not going to withdraw. On August 4th, they invade Germany, and so all of the dominoes have fallen, and we now have a war going on. So in an age of assassins, when this is not the only assassination that has occurred in the 20th century, why did a Balkan crisis lead to a world war? Why did it escalate like this? Question 2 for Serbia. Well, first of all, Austria-Hungary and the Serbian governments, they both believe that their credibility was on the line. We can't back down, or else we are no longer going to be a player on the world stage. For Serbia, we're no longer going to be respected as an independent country. If we back down, then Austria-Hungary walks all over us. Just like the Ottoman Empire had walked over us for a while, just like anybody else might try to. So they believe their credibility is on the line and they're going to stand up. They both believe they're in a strong position to win. Austria-Hungary knows it has Germany's backing. Serbia is hoping and then knows that they have Russia's backing. Those are strong allies and they believe that they will help. They are all also focused on the spoils of war. For Austria, this is increasing their territory. This is hanging on to Bosnia, which Serbia was trying to pry away. For Serbia, this is a strong southern Slavic state that they would hope to be able to be the leader of. And they think that, well, if the Central Powers lose, then maybe we'll get this. We'll see if they do. And they all have too little fear of war. Their understanding of war is based off of 19th century ideas of weaponry, of what war looks like. And yes, it was devastating. They were usually over relatively quickly compared to what we are about to see. And the level of devastation caused by the technology that has developed even from like the 7 Weeks War and the Franco-Prussian War until the beginning of World War I, the technology has grown exponentially in a way that is going to lead to huge losses of life. In sum, for Serbia, there's just too many leaders in 1914 who were deliberately deciding to risk crisis and war. Regardless of the consequences, we're going to risk this. And the initial Austria-Serb combat as a result. During World War I, Serbia is initially attacked, but then will try to fight back. So Austria-Hungary is bombing Belgrade, the capital of Serbia, the same night they declared war. That's July 28th. In 1914, Serbia is repelling the Austrian invasions twice, but ultimately is unsuccessful after that. So in 1914, they're able to withstand the two attempts that Austria takes, one in September, one in December, to invade their country. And they actually start an attack against Austria. They invade southern Austrian territory, but they are repelled. And the reason they make that attack is because the Allies asked them to. They asked them to go on the offensive, and so they feel like they need to. In terms of being war ready or prepared for war, Serbia is probably not as far along as some of these other countries because it's much smaller and it doesn't have as many resources. But it did have more seasoned and capable officers because after coming out of the Balkan Wars, their officers have just been through a war and they have some capable training, and they are probably even better strategically mindset-wise than the Austrians were. But their army's not prepped for war. They are not ready for this. They lack a railroad network for moving supplies. They have not been putting arms development, or putting money into arms development, and they have not been significantly training. Austria has a much larger and a much more well-equipped army. Everybody's maybe I should just stand over here so I can just watch the snow too and be distracted. Okay, Austria has a larger and more equipped army. That should be obvious why that's the case. Austria is so much larger than Serbia. And in 1915, Bulgaria joins the Central Powers and is helping to defeat helping to defeat Serbia's forces. This is going to be a kicker for Serbia because they were just withstanding, and now that as Austria gets help from Germany and from Bulgaria, they're not going to be able to withstand anymore. The Serbian front, if we look at a map, this is where Serbia is. So there's two main areas where they are being attacked. One is up here in the north, directly into Austria-Hungary. The other is to the east, across from Bulgaria. And the Austrians know that the Serbians have better defenses up here, so they're trying to send their attacks through this direction. And eventually, by 1915, that's going to end up being successful, and they're going to have to evacuate. So they evacuate across their country through Albania to this tiny island down here at the edge of the map called Corfu. It's actually like a Greek holiday resort destination type place now, but it's where Serbia had to set up their government in exile during World War I. So the beginning, they're initially successful. In 1915, in addition to the Bulgarian forces joining Austria, they also are ravaged by typhus. Typhus is a disease, it's a communicable disease that often spreads in war zones when there's not enough sanitation and not enough nutrition available to people, and the conditions are really poor. So typhus ravages the front lines of the Serbians, and a lot of people will die because of that. In the end, 200,000 soldiers and civilians fled over the mountains to Albania, evacuated by sea to Corfu. This is where their government in exile is established. There's 125,000 military deaths, but 65% of those are due to disease, largely due to typhus. So disease was a record, not just for Serbia, but that's one example of how much disease affected the lines. 650,000 civilian deaths in Serbia. When a war is being fought on your territory, it's hard to avoid civilian deaths, and that's definitely the case for Serbia. Towards the end of 1918, after the government had been in exile and Austria-Hungary's forces have been controlling Serbia for a while with Bulgaria, the Allied forces helped Serbia push back the Bulgarian forces and they retake their land. The Allies had been trying to break out from a Greek port, now called Thessaloniki, but they had not been successful during most of the war because they just weren't putting that much effort into it. There was not enough strategic significance to the Serbian front for the Allies to move from the Western Front or the Eastern Front to go there and help out. But towards the end of 1918, when they're starting to be much more successful, they help Serbia and the Bulgarian forces retake their land. And the Serbia, as well as the three different groups that had previously been part of Austria-Hungary, the Croat, Serb, and Slovene provinces of Austria-Hungary, they all joined together to form the country that we know as Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia lasted through much of the 20th century, so it definitely has a big impact on 20th century politics. But they formed Yugoslavia December 1st, 1918, right after the armistice. So these are the three, or not three, sorry, these are the several areas that are forming Yugoslavia. And you can see where they kind of match up to the map I showed you earlier. We have Macedonia, we have Serbia, which was in existence before, Kosovo, which will later become an autonomous area, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Slovenia, and I'm not going to try to say that one. But they are all areas that will eventually, most of them will, after Yugoslavia falls, become independent nations. So as a recap for Serbia, nationalism and the volatile relationships of the Balkans brought Serbia into total war and ultimately brought its defeat by the Central Powers. However, with the final Allied victory came an opportunity to reshape the Balkans by creating a southern Slavic state through a union of Croats, Slovenes, and Serbs. Serbia became the power center of the new state. With the creation of Yugoslavia on December 1st, 1918, and I didn't finish that sentence, the striving for Balkan nationalism was achieved, at least in the short term. All right, so we're going to transition here to Italy. Italy is, again, part of that Triple Alliance, and then it is going to break, you guys all ever, I'm going to go back this direction. Okay, Italy is originally allied to Germany and Austria-Hungary through the Triple Alliance, but it will change its mind as we go through the process of joining the war. So here is Italy. We have the Austro-Hungarian Empire across the shores. We have Montenegro, and this is Albania. Serbia is over here, where I just showed you. And then we have France, Switzerland, and up there is still part of Austria-Hungary that are all bordering.
Whoa.
The situation in Italy at the start of World War I is that it is still dealing with the effects of its late nationalization. So it just became a country 40 years ago. So it already had problems when it formed as a country, and now it's going to face some of those same, some of those leftover issues from its nation building. First of all, it's late to industrialize. We know that. It was not an industrial nation. The North had some limited industry, but the South really didn't, and the rest of the country is still struggling. So the industry that it does have is unevenly distributed throughout the peninsula. It's a young democracy. We know that. It still has a North versus South conflict that has not been fully resolved. These tensions have existed since unification, and they have not been fixed. The South is not industrialized. It's not able to produce enough. It has to buy foreign goods, especially wheat. That's going to become an issue later when food shortages occur. And it has not tried for a whole lot of social reforms since its formation as a country. There are heavy taxes, which are causing revolts in the South who can't afford heavy taxes. The bourgeoisie is upset because they have not been given a more important role. This is, again, a hangover kind of from how the country formed. Those 1848 revolutions, liberalism did not work out. The middle class did not get to lead. What happened? So there's still resentments there, but they still don't have an important role, and we'll see that affect the political outcome of the war. Economic problems are caused by their social problems, and Italy is struggling. So in 1914 then, if it is still kind of struggling, it makes sense that Italy would declare neutrality, that it does not want to have a massive war on its hands. The population does not want to have a massive war on its hands. The out for Italy is that the Triple Alliance is a defensive alliance. Austria-Hungary had to be attacked for that alliance to kick in, for Italy to need to come to their defense. They don't need to come to their defense if Austria-Hungary is the one making the attack, and so they don't. The Italian population is pretty much entirely against the war. Most major news publications are against the war. The different groups, peasants as well as middle class, they don't see a wisdom in entering the war, and they don't want Italy to join. For the peasants specifically, especially those in the South, this concept of our nation going to war, our country going to war, it has still not fully developed from 40 years ago or 50 years ago when they formed as a country. So they're against war. So this is what it would have looked like, but Italy will break off and decide to stay neutral. Treaty of London is a secret treaty that's agreed to by France, Russia, and Britain with Italy on April 26, 1915. And this is a game changer for Italy because the Italian government needs something to kick in order to start bringing the country together and hopefully to be a kickstarter for industrialization and for being able to make lots of money. Now, whether war was a good reason to go after that, we'll see. The Allied goal is Italy joins the war, that creates another front for Austria-Hungary, that puts more pressure on Germany, that takes pressure away from the Russian front, and perhaps is going to help us end the war sooner. So if they can do that, if they can draw Austria-Hungary away from their forces in Russia, make Germany commit more to Russia, and they would be able to close in, hopefully. So you can see the long-term plan for the other allies. But for Italy, it still probably doesn't make all that much sense. But they are promised land. So here we have a map of Italy and then the land they are promised. So the Secret Treaty of Washington is going to give them these areas. If I could bring them up. Okay, so we have Southern Tyrol, or Tyrol. I'm not, again, my pronunciation with these are not so great. But this is basically an area of southern Austria that Italy would then get to control and add to its domains. Trieste, which there's a port city here, Fiume, which is an important port city that they would like to have, but also the rest of the land. And then Dalmatia, or northern Dalmatia, which eventually will be part of Croatia, is another area that they would like to control, and they are promised it. So for the Italian government, this is why we're going to go to war. We're going to get something out of it. They start to try to create a nationalism aspect to this. Pro-war demonstrations. They're trying to convince the nation that this is a good idea for us. If we go to war, this will bring our nation together, and look at everything we will get. But why would they really do it? They don't have any suitable production or financial institutions that can support a war. They have not been prepping for this, and the country is really not wealthy enough to just do it. They can't just start initially producing things that they have not been planning for when they don't have the money or the infrastructure to do it. They also can't feed their own people. They're having to import food. So in a war situation, if you don't have an import and export ability because, say, a navy is blockading your peninsula, you're going to struggle with providing for your people. And if that's the case, then this is going to put even more pressure on the everyday citizen in Italy. So not military prepared, they're not ready to feed everybody, and the reality of the technological war is already evident. They already know what war looks like. They already see what the trench system has developed into on the front in World War I. They know how many people are, they're getting reports of how many people are dying. They are aware of what the war might do to Italy. But they decide to enter it anyway. So the reasoning is that they want to be a European power. This is basically a nationalistic goal for Italy. They would like to be considered to be great. They would like to think that glory can be brought about if they win this war. They're going to participate alongside the powerful British and French allies. That's going to bring up their glory if they can be considered an equal to those two. They believe that it's going to be a brief war. Why they still believe that when everybody else thought the war was going to be over by Christmas and now it's April, we don't know. But they believe that that maybe their participation is going to kickstart the end of the war. They believe it's going to be profitable. They are hoping that the war is going to bring to them salvation to their financial problems. And that's not going to be the case, but they think it will. And they think it's going to unite the country. If we go back to what Cavour did in 1854 to try to go join the Crimean War and then get allies to join because of it, if maybe World War I to the Italian leaders at the time kind of feels like that. We go here, we get allies, we become great, we can solve some of our problems. That's what they would like to have happen. So for Italy, to sum it up, they entered the war for nationalistic purposes, to gain land, and to take their place among the major powers of Europe. Next question. What was Italy's involvement in the war, and what were its consequences? So Italy was a minor power compared to the rest of the Allies because of the amount of technology and especially the amount of men they were able to contribute. But for Italy itself, it was a major impact, just not as big of an impact as the Allies maybe would have wanted. So the soldiers in the military lack training, and their army is small. They lack heavy artillery, machine guns, and ammunition, so they're not very, they have not been able to equip their soldiers very well. Their initial military action was successful. The element of attack means that they were able to surprise Austria-Hungary a little bit and be able to initially be successful, but eventually it's going to drop into a stalemate the same way that the other fronts have dropped into trench warfare. Long drawn out battles that are costing thousands of lives each time, It's commonplace that a battle will last a long time and several thousand people will die. For the Italian front, it is taking place in northern Italy, so all along the lines between Austria and Italy here. These purple areas are areas that Austria-Hungary and Germany are later going to be able to attack and push the front down, but for a while the line is stabilized around here where it's red. The difference between this front and some of the others is that this is in the mountains. This is in the Southern Alps, so a lot of the fighting is taking place in areas that are really rugged terrain, and it's really cold in winter. For the Italian front, trench warfare is static for just about 3 years. The Battle of Caporetto in October of 1917, this is one of the battles that's probably the biggest losses for Italy. The Italians and Germans were able to advance 100 kilometers where I showed you in the purple lines. So those huge losses suffered by Italy are in manpower, in humans, but also in territory. The Battle of Vittorio Veneto, a year later, exactly a year later, is where Italy will start to find success again. And obviously this is right here at the end of the war when the Central Powers are starting to crumble anyway, but they are able to achieve a final victory against the Austrians and push them out, and this is October of 1918. So what is the cost of war for Italy? 600,000 lives with hundreds of thousands of people are wounded. So for Italy, the human cost is huge. The casualty rate is actually higher than Britain's. It's 39.1% of its forces suffered casualties during the war. The nationalist poet D'Annunzio called it a mutilated victory. It's a mutilated victory for them. So they won, they're part of the Allied group that won, but it's not a full victory. So there's several ways in which that's the case. One, obviously, being the loss of human life. 5 million men had served in the army, so a lot of people have been mobilized for the war effort. The workforce had also been mobilized in total war. So if the entire workforce is being developed into participating in industries that they maybe didn't have before, trying to convert suddenly to a militaristic industry is not easy, and they mobilize a lot of people in this. Because of this, a lot of soldiers and a lot of workers have experienced this coming together, fighting for something, and then seeing that it didn't quite come to fruition the way they wanted. Soldiers and workers are all going to become more politically motivated, which can be a really nice thing, really good thing for your country if people are really interested in investing in what's going on. But what's happening in Italy is they are also becoming extremely radicalized. And that's going to have a huge impact on what happens in Italy next, as we know that kind of the next stage for Italy is the rise of Mussolini. So the radicalization of workers and soldiers has a big impact after the war as more radical leaders are chosen. So social and economic impact for Italy, we see in terms of how much money they spent, they fall down here beneath Russia, but for a country that joined late and didn't have that much money to begin with, this is a huge expenditure for Italy in terms of its how much money it had to spend. $13 billion between 1914 and 1919. The total spent by all nations was $186 billion. Social and economic impact continued. The major impact on the economy was that they had forced industrialization. Because they had forced industrialization, that's going to hurt their agricultural production. When you are putting all of your resources into one basket, which is a new basket for you, this agriculture side of the deal is going to suffer quite a bit. And we already know that they had trouble supporting their own population with food, so add that to the pressures of the war, and the population is experiencing huge shortage of food. So food supplies are low. Even though it's not subject to a naval blockade, it is still having a really hard time feeding its people. The government is also using a lot of authoritarian measures during the war. So that means that people were experiencing total war as a change in the way that they were governed. Their freedoms were being limited, which obviously a lot of people would fight back against that too. So individuals and organizations are prosecuted for anti-war sentiments, which is interesting considering the fact that everybody was pretty much anti-war prior to the war beginning, except for the government. If you abandon your workplace, if you stopped going to work, you could be considered the equivalent of a soldier who deserted the front line. You could be captured, prosecuted, put in jail, and suffer the consequences of that. Workers are also exploited. They're spending 16 to 18 hours working a day for pretty low wages, and they had no choice but to work overtime. It was compulsory. So for your worker, you can understand why they're going to be looking for a different type of government, maybe even looking for a radical government after experiencing wartime conditions like this. All of this maybe would have been made better if Italy got what it was promised. If Italy got what was promised, maybe the government could have convinced everybody that we were okay, that we pushed together as a nation to do what we were trying to do, and we accomplished our goals, and therefore it was all worth it. But that's not what happened. Italy doesn't get everything that it's promised. The Versailles negotiations give Italy some of the European land they wanted, but it denies them access to land in Africa that they were also requesting. They did not get Dalmatia, they did not get the Port of Fiume, which becomes a significant issue. That poet that I mentioned earlier, who said it was a mutilated victory, a few years later, he's going to lead an assault, gather together forces, not government forces, and lead an assault on the Port of Fiume so that they can take it. He's going to occupy it for about a year until they, diplomatically get out of there. But it's a big deal to Italians. This is what we went to war for, and we don't have it. That's going to not go over well with the Italian population. They do get some things. They get Tyrol and Istria, which is the area north of Fiume. Here's Fiume right here, but so they get right next to it, but they don't actually get that city. And these are only gained due to the armistice that they signed, not to the Treaty of Versailles. Treaty of Versailles does not go super well for the Italians. And it's still not enough to solve their problems. So they can't convince the public it's enough to solve their problems, and it does not solve their economic issues at all. So at the end of that, Italy is left asking, war, what is it good for? Any questions?
You can end the video.